Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasmine. I go by Jazz, pronouns she, her, and I'm the project and administrative coordinator at CSAJ. Just a first heads up, this webinar is being recorded so that you all are aware. And if you need any support, any technical support, please feel free to reach out to TA for any requests that you have. We encourage all of you to use the chat for engagements. Later, as just mentioned, we will be conducting breakout rooms to be a part of this call. So please be prepared for that section. We hope to have a lively and engaging session today, and we're really thrilled about today's deep dive and discussion. Also, if there's anything that's resonating with you at the moment, I'm going to drop in the chat our Twitter in which you can mention us and on Twitter so that we can see whatever you're resonating with and that we can have the opportunity to retweet you as well. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to one of my colleagues.
Hi, everyone. Jazz, slides, please. Hi, everyone. My name is Inkira Aduba. I'm the Capacity Building Manager at CSAJ. Welcome to this discussion. We're very excited to have you all here. The title of our discussion today is Integrating. I'll wait for the slide to pop up and then. So the title of our discussion today is Integrating an Intersectional Anti-Oppression Approach into Advocacy. And this is part of our Access eCourse learning exchanges that some of you may be familiar with. We're really excited to have you here. Next slide, please. And we're looking forward to a very great discussion. And we're hoping that you bring your full selves here or show up as you choose to show up today. We're very grateful that you're here. CSAJ's mission promotes advocacy approaches that remove systemic barriers, enhance organizational responses, and improve professional practices to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. Our vision is a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. With that, we have two very wonderful presenters and partners who have worked with CSAJ on several different projects, and I will hand over to them very shortly. I see some of you have started to introduce yourselves in the chat. Thank you. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. So I'll hand over to our fantastic presenters today, Camille Holmes and Munamuru. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inkiri, for that introduction. I'm going to pop our slides up now in just a moment. If someone is able to just share that, confirm that they're able to see that, that would be helpful. Great. Thank you all so much. Wonderful. Thank you so much for an introduction, and we're going to get started today. My name is Mona Muro, and I'm joined with my colleague today, Camille, and we're going to do a little bit more deeper introductions in just a moment, but we wanted to set the groundwork and the framing for today's conversation. Our format for today, we're going to kind of have a couple different sections in which we have 3 different content areas of discussion with some prompting questions as well as breakout groups, as Jazz mentioned. We're going to set the groundwork, first of all, with some background information, some dialogue, and then engage ourselves as well together. The themes that we have today are a few big topics, but a few mighty but big. Really, we're centering our conversation today around proactive agency, and those objectives, and the way that we hope to get to that conversation is really by discussing systemic thinking, really from a proactive lens, and with us centering survivors who have intersectional anti-oppression lens, that framework in particular. And we want to make sure that as these survivors that we're centering with intersectional lived identities and experiences, that we're centering that with the intent to create a more survivor-centered world. The discussion really is also going to be aimed at what leadership looks like and what we can do to help support leadership in our spaces and what we need in those spaces to make that happen, and what we ourselves bring to that conversation and to that topic. Also want to take a few minutes to kind of set ourselves in some grounding pieces of information. We see this often in our space, just setting a few intentions for the space and some agreements. We mentioned a minute ago, we're going to have different ways for us to participate. And so we understand that everybody has different learning styles and engagement styles. And so we want to acknowledge and save space for that. We can participate through breakout groups as well as the chat box. We do want to encourage folks to use the raise hand function. It's at the top of your Zoom box, I believe underneath let me make sure I'm not going to get this wrong. We'll just say at the top of the box here. If someone wants to share in the chat box where exactly that is, that would be much appreciated. But it's in your chat box Zoom toolbar. Once you raise your hand, we'll go ahead and have some support from our partners to call on you, and you can unmute and share verbally if that's the choice and way you'd like to participate. A couple of other pieces for our space today. Our group agreements, we want to really center, lessons learned. We know that we share and we want to create a space that's multi-directional, multi-learning. As we learn, those lessons can leave. We also want to ensure that as we share and get to vulnerable pieces of ourselves and sharing our stories and our experiences, that those personal stories and vulnerabilities stay here, because those are ours to decide what happens with those. We do want to encourage folks to have this space as a time that we're processing and learning together. As I mentioned, this is a growing space. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, and the way that we grow is through that discomfort and by taking this time and energy to have this space and hold this space together. It does require some vulnerability and some time and some energy for us to be in relation with each other. And what I mean by that is we often spend a lot of times kind of alone or one-on-one spaces. And a piece of that is some of our individual reflection work. And we have to grow together and be in relation with each other for us to be able to support each other. And so that's really critical, to be in relation with each other as we're being our vulnerable and authentic selves. And we do want to elevate that as we have these conversations, things, it's a hard conversation to have. It's a hard topic to get to. It is uncomfortable. And there can be impacts that cause harm. We all have the ability to cause harm. And our intentions might be positive, and yet that still can be an outcome. And so recognition that we are human, and as a part of our humanity, that is something that we are capable of doing. And we want to learn and grow together, recognize that harm, and figure out a way for us to remedy that harm with folks that are impacted. I do want to also take a minute to recognize that we are in a space where folks are coming to this conversation with different power and privileges, and that those dynamics exist. And so I want us individually and as a collective to be mindful. What that looks like for you is going to be different than someone else. So just take a minute to check in, kind of see how you feel with that space. Let us know if there's anything that we can do to help, for example, in the breakout groups, to create a more equitable space where you feel like your voice is being heard. You can DM and direct message our CSAJ folks to let them know if there's any specific items that you'd like with your breakout group. And then the last piece is just participation, self-reflection. This kind of comes out in a lot of different ways. Some people say kind of step up or step back, or just kind of be aware of how much energy and space that you are occupying in this conversation. We all participate different. Again, it could be the text box, it could be, talking, it could be observing as a form of participation. And we just want to encourage everybody to check in with themselves and ask, where am I taking space? Where am I giving space and opening space for folks? And doing a little bit of that mental check-in as we have the conversation. And so with that said, I want us to kind of dig in and start having our conversation. I want to bring my colleague Camille into the conversation. Thank you, Camille.
Great. Thank you so much, Mona, and welcome everyone. It is delightful to be here with you today. I've seen we have a lot of wisdom on the call. There are a lot of people coming with a lot of expertise, a lot of really important experiences to share, and we want to hear from you. I want to encourage folks, if it is comfortable for you and if it is something that you choose, to turn on your camera, because we really do want to have a conversation. And I do know that people are in places where they may not be able to do that, or they may choose not to do it, but I'm issuing the invitation if you are able and willing. So why are we having this conversation? And it's an obvious question, but I always have to ask it at the beginning, because people start in very different spaces. There are those of us who have talked about race and class and gender and intersectionality until we're blue in the face, and we will continue to talk about it until our last dying breath. It's like what we, live to talk about. And there are other folks who are newer to the conversation and maybe still like learning language, learning how to process all the emotions that come up with it. And so I just want to say that we're going to try to meet everyone where you are, and are welcome, and ask grace when we're not in the same thought, in the places that we thought we expected. I want to echo that any of us will make mistakes, but this is a place where we want to hold everyone together. So I have worked with CSAJ as an advisor, trainer, facilitator for a good while now. Love this space. I helped to create the module that we are discussing today, integrating an intersectional anti-oppression approach into advocacy. And this course was designed for non-lawyer legal advocates to build capacity to engage in survivor-centered economic advocacy. So there's a legal context that we're working in, but there's also the societal context, and understanding how racism and other forms of oppression operate at multiple levels all the time, impacting the way we work and the way we navigate our lives, is a part of understanding how to do this work well, and how to do this work in a way that is not reproducing the advantages and disadvantages that are distributed in a particular way in our society. And so I'm just going to ask for like a show of hands. They can be the reactions. Was anyone able to watch the videos from Futures Without Violence? I think we put a link in the registration. If you didn't, there's no problem, but I just wanted to get a sense. But at least one, a couple, one, two, okay. And that's fine. The videos were created by an organization called Futures Without Violence. You're probably familiar with them. If you're not, I commend their work to you. The overview that I want to provide before we get into a deeper conversation about our identities and who is in this room now having this conversation and why that's important is, why look at anti-racism and anti-oppression work as anti-violence work? Like, what is anti-violence work really about? And ultimately, the root of violence is about, oppression of some kind. The impulse to control others, the feeling that you have the right to control others, the response to being controlled or hurt in some way. I would say it's not possible to fight violence, to address the issues of violence without fighting all forms of oppression. And that is oppression based on race, gender, sexual orientation, language, national origin, immigration status, disability status, survivor status, and much, much more. What is racism? I don't want to go too low, too short, too low, hit below where you are or too far above where you are. So I'm just going to try to do a brief little definition. Racism operates differently across the globe. Concepts of race differ across the globe and change over time. In this country, in the United States, with our history of genocide and enslavement of Native Americans, and then the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans, racism is a complex structure that operates like at an individual level, an interpersonal level, institutionally, and in our laws, the way that our institutions are built, our societal structures, the images that we produce to say who we are as a country, who we are in the world. Some people would talk about racism as like prejudice plus power, the power of state institutions and the power of all the imagery and history to back up someone's belief that you're better than or worse than another person. But it's also not just the individual like animus. It's not just bigotry. It's also the fact that our society was segregated by law. It's the fact that our movies for so long only showed cis white male or people we thought were cis white male leads, and so showed them as the best, and only mostly ever showed, the poor Black or brown or Native person or Mexican person or Chinese person as someone who had less. All of us have to unlearn these things. I'm still unlearning today, and I talk about this all the time because it's deep in our DNA. And so what I'd like to do is have us do a little talking amongst ourselves about, what identities are important to us. I identify as a Black cisgender woman with a strong Southern identity. I was raised in Memphis, Tennessee, and my grandparents and great-grandparents and great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and maybe one more back are all from the Southern United States. And from there, they either go to England and Scotland or to a place in Africa that I can't identify because there are no records for me to avail myself of. That impacts how I view the world, and that impacts how the world views me. I do not have an immigrant story to tell, and so I'm still learning in that space. I do not have a visible disability. I'm still learning in that space, but I can identify with and empathize with and educate myself about the struggle, the struggles and the joys, the assets and the needs of each part of those communities and how they intersect with my own experience. I'm going to ask Mona to introduce herself, and then I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves to each other and put a couple of questions in the box, and then we'll go into breakout. So Mona, go ahead.
Thank you, Camille. Yes, I've done this multiple times now, and I think it's always interesting to have this question and this reflection time. And I feel like each time I've had this reflection around my lived experiences and my identities, I recognize and I elevate additional pieces of myself. And so I wanted to just share that really quickly as we have this conversation. My name's Mona Muro, and as I think about the lived experiences and identities that I have, and that I've experienced in the past, that I have now, and the ones that I will have in the future, I acknowledge and really recognize right now that I am a survivor of more than one abusive relationship in my life. I'm a survivor of physical, emotional, and sexual violence. I'm a survivor of growing up in a home where violence was present, where my household was, for kind of American standards, considered to be very poor. We were on every public benefit program that was available in the 90s before welfare reform. And I'm a survivor of organizational trauma and abuse. I'm also the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants. I identify as a cis hetero woman, and I'm a person who has both seen and I'm going to say unseen physical and mental health issues. I'm also a person with white passing privilege. I have a master's degree. I have a steady income. I have healthcare coverage. I have access to credit. I'm a homeowner, and I share all of that to offer insight into my lived experiences, my identities, how those intersectional things have created my history, how systems have created oppressed experiences for me, and also what my privileges are that I have in this space. So thank you for offering that space. I'll turn it back to you, Camille.
Thank you so much, Mona, for that. And I invite each of you to introduce yourself in the ways that are important to you. I left out a whole lot, and I'm not going to do it right now just because of time, but we're going to go into breakouts, and I'm going to just say out loud the instructions, and then we'll put them in the chat. The instruction is to introduce yourself with your name, your racial and gender identities, other identities that are important to you, and then to have a conversation that considers these two questions. And I'll leave it to you, like where the emphasis is. One is, how do your identities, your multiple and overlapping identities, inform and impact your work? And two, what populations does your organization work best or worst for? So we'll put those are in the chat now, and we will send you off to groups. You'll be back in about 10 minutes.
Also, please make sure you let me know if you need ASL interpretation, so I can put you in a room with this interpretation.
And as that's happening, I believe it will happen, but if folks have comments that they want to share in the chat or hands raised, feel free.
Absolutely. Thanks, Camille. Just so folks know what to expect, we are expecting folks to be in several breakout groups. There are going to be in size from 3 people a group. And so they will be smaller groups. That way that allows folks to be able to communicate in a smaller, intimate setting. So expect to be partnered with about 3 folks in a group.
Welcome back. I hope that you were able to connect with your colleagues, that you talked with each other well. I'm wondering if folks could share either in the chat or raise hand a few things that you took away from your conversation. You could talk about what you talked about or your lessons learned from the conversation. We'll let everyone else hold on to their own stories. And while we're doing that, I'm just going to share a quote in the chat. This is a quote from the movie that I referenced from Futures with Justice. It says, the anti-violence movement has created a service delivery model that works for disproportionately white, heterosexual, able-bodied, temporarily poor women. And when we think of anyone outside of those categories, they're not being served adequately. They are not having access to resources. Is that your experience? Is that your experience, the experience you observe for survivors? Is that your experience as a staff person in the space that you're in? What are your thoughts? Unfortunately, true. We have some from the chat. And I will tell you all know a lot more about this than we do. So we'll have a lot more fun and learn a lot more if we can either hear your voices or your reflections. Perfect. And we have just a few minutes. I appreciate people putting things in the chat. We could take 1 or 2 people to popcorn, something that you took away from sharing with your colleagues. Did you talk to each other?
As folks continue to contribute in the chat box, I think one thing I'll share from some of my experiences, and it was also echoed in some of the Futures pieces, were how we see services that are not survivors centered and equitable in language access. Someone just shared, we got a couple.
Yeah.
I'll pause there.
There's a need for recruitment. Some people have not had the experience, but others feel like they would be treated differently if they were a woman and not in the same sex male relationship.
I could chime in on something that I kind of got from our group and in my own personal experience in my organization is that there's a lack of education in regards to domestic violence or sexual assault, saying that only one particular group is more susceptible to it. And then it kind of creates a lot of shame for other groups, genders, religion, culture, races, that maybe they don't belong to the mainstream group. Maybe it's not applicable to them, so they're not coming forward. And there isn't a lot of education in our society, and people are just not talking about it. It's kind of like beneath the surface topic that you just talk about in hush hush behind closed doors, or if you're in the field of social justice.
Thank you for sharing. Is it Vered? I apologize.
No, I was on mute. Yes, it's Vered.
Vered, okay. Certainly, we have all walked into the waiting room where everyone looks either low income Black person or speaking one language that's not English. And the assumption is that it's either there's something about these people that makes them need services, or that the system that we live in is broken. And it's the latter. But especially when most of the faces that we see in leadership in these service organizations, and most of the faces that we see giving service are white or are privileged, are middle class, are of a certain, and so not talking about it reinforces this assumption about who is, I want to say, damaged, right? Who has these problems, as opposed to how do we make the system so that it supports everyone from the beginning? How do we prevent violence? How do we prevent re-traumatization by a system that wasn't built really with survivors and survivors of color and trans survivors in mind? I will stop there and pass to Mona for a shift to actually focusing on the systems. Thanks for having a conversation and bringing yourselves and your identities into the space with your colleagues.
Thank you, Camille. And folks in the chat box have actually started to kind of transition to what this looks like out in the field and what these systemic inequities are really showing up and how they're showing up. Someone's sharing some housing experiences and what that looks like in the chat. So thank you for sharing that. We're starting to kind of lay that groundwork for our experiences in the work and the movement, how our identities show up as we do this work, and how systems interact with us based on our identities and lived experiences in this world, right? And when I was thinking about how to approach this, the work that I have done for many years has been economic based. And so my brain kind of goes that way. It goes to economic and it goes to housing, as those are things that we often elevate as priorities for the survivors that we're working with. And so I'm just going to take a little bit of a minute to kind of narrow in on that, because this anti-oppression and racism work is so big. We know that it impacts us all, but a way for me to be able to think about this and explore this a little bit more tangibly is with, some examples and what that looks like, in the real world for people that we're working with. And as I think about this from the economic and kind of housing lens, folks that we're working with, those survivors with multiple intersectional oppressed identities and lived experiences, we know that their needs are not being met, right? As Camille just mentioned, that we often tend to think about the person versus why the system isn't working for them, because it is often meant for certain folks with less intersectional identities that have been historically oppressed. So we see, folks unable to secure safe, sustainable, affordable, quality housing. We see our BIPOC, LGBT young adults and young youth with, maybe aging out of the system, maybe having some criminal history, unestablished credit often, and also experiences with some mental health diagnosis. And all of those kind of compounding intersectional identities often prepare them for moving into the world and looking for example, housing in a way that's not going to be able to meet their needs. We also see survivors that we work with disabilities and mixed immigration statuses have evictions. And these are just some ways that these intersectional identities and lived experiences that have experienced oppression. And I'm noting that there because we all have different lived experiences and identities. And not all of those things are oppressed or have had historical oppression in those. And so as we note that, we have to then look at what are those systems processes that are happening and how can we look at the intersection of oppression and racism to remedy them? We often have seen our LGBTQ folks just straight up be discriminated against. There are lots of state laws that allow that to happen when it comes to housing. There's housing income discrimination. So even in the chance that we're able to help our youth survivors get into housing, they can be discriminated according to their income if they have a voucher in certain parts of this country. We also see, different kinds of systemic barriers when it comes to immigration policy, bureaucracy, and identification requirements. So even being able to access an apartment, sometimes the housing market, the housing system requires specific types of identification. So like say an actual driver's license that in communities, and some folks may not have a specific kind of driver's license or ID. They might have a matricula. I'm from Texas. And so that's often a type of ID that survivors might be using. So those policies that we create are systemic barriers to our survivors being able to access these particular resources and safety. And so as we think about those experiences, those all create those compounding impacts. We also see our responses to that be responsive that are at the micro level, really reactive. We, as in the advocates that are doing this work and survivors out in the world, it makes it harder for them to be able to remedy those systemic wrongs because they don't have the power and the privilege of that dominant culture. And so what that means on the ground level is that we have to do more advocacy. We have to figure out if that criminal history is a conviction of some sort that is connected to that DV community history? And if it is, maybe we can support and work through that to be able to open that opportunity. If there is a source of discrimination piece, is there, state law that prohibits that? Or is there wiggle room around municipalities to do advocacy? We push a lot for funding dollars. And so for housing dollars for survivors. And so how can we continue to do that, as well as advocate for broader things across the board that are going to allow for access to safe, secure housing for survivors that isn't just tied to their survivorship, right? And so all of these are kind of compounding pieces that we are, one, experiencing in the field, and also creating systems response to. The systemic element that I want to also highlight here is in cases where we're able to support survivors through fruition to, let's say, secure housing, where we also see systemic oppression and racism is in the community. It's systems and community colluding together, for example, to centralize communities of color. We often see historical areas that have been disinvested in. And so areas that if we're able to secure and help support folks in securing housing, they may be experiencing a food desert more than likely. The schools that their children may be, being segued into might be communities that have been disinvested in, or their ISD is lower ranked when it comes to education. And so we see a lot of also systemic collusion to kind of double down on racism and oppression and history in our work that really is outside of our historical movement work. And so that's where I will elevate this item on proactive agency in our work. Where is our opportunity to look at this proactive anti-oppression and anti-racism work? It's long-term work. It feels really big sometimes, but it's work that really helps us get closer to the root. I'm going to do that closer to the root just because I have a tree behind me too. And I feel like I'm vibing with that analogy. As Camille said earlier, this gender-based violence work is oppression work. It's anti-oppression work. And we need to really think about our framing in a different way. We want to start to explore this in a way that prioritizes anti-oppression work and anti-racism work at the forefront. So where we used to start with DB 101 and what does that look like, I would encourage us to explore anti-oppression and anti-racism work as the basis for our work, starting with the conversation around gender-based violence as it connects to anti-oppression work, as it connects to capitalism, and how has that historically been connected to slavery, to historical exploitation of labor, and how that now is connected to income inequality and low wages. And those low wages are often what sets up our survivors and their families in a place that has reduced resources and reduced access. And so all of that interconnectedness is an area for us to grow in this movement work, is to elevate this interconnectedness, because as we're thinking about our survivors and their multifaceted lives, their intersectional experiences and identities, we're thinking about our service provision, and we simultaneously have to think about what that looks like from the systemic proactive lens. So I'm going to stop there and want to elevate this conversation for us to now have in some of our breakout groups. We've got 2 questions there that will pop in the chat box for us. Again, it's kind of looking at, one, if we could explore what DV practices and services look like for folks that they were designed to be most easily used for survivors with intersectional oppressed identities and lived experiences. So if we are going to center those folks, what might that look like? And 2, where do we see opportunity for that proactive advocacy, for that proactive movement work that's going to help us get closer to the root, that helps us move that work past what we're doing now into these other community systems that are still creating systemic oppression for our survivors. Staying with us and having your time in your group, and welcome back. A couple big questions. So let's just dive in. What things stood out to you? Any takeaways that you would like to share from anything you contributed in the group, or a lesson learned from the group?
And
Deborah?
I'm gonna,
Oh, I apologize, Deborah. Were you wanting to share? Oh, I apologize. Okay.
No, I'm okay.
I'll say I was making up a story about Deborah's hand movements because these are such big questions, right? Like, how do we imagine something that we haven't seen? How do we imagine what's needed without first going to like what somebody needs right this moment? So it's a huge lift that we're asking, but it's also just sort of setting up the conversation to say, what are the things that we can do? What are the things we could be imagining? What have we seen that maybe we want to take from somewhere else that gets us a step closer?
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and that's why the question is like, how do we get kind of closer, right? Closer to the root, right? Because okay, I think that conversation may not be for us. That's okay too. Yeah. So I think that's where the questioning is like, how do we get a little bit closer? We want to explore, right, as much as we can. And you're right, we still have to do the things that we're doing right now. It doesn't discount the work that we're doing. We still have to work to address the immediate needs of our survivors. We still have to do the immediate housing work that we're, paying the double deposits, as someone kind of said, working with landlords who have, shown, exhibited racism. That educational piece may be an opportunity, but also exploring other opportunities with other people and other landlords that we have a better history with, right? We still have to do all of these pieces of work simultaneously. And as I was thinking about it, like I said, we can start at the baseline. Part of this is easy. It's like that prevention and education piece is even for our movement. How do we embed this anti-oppression work and anti-racism as the foundation piece? That, again, brings us into and gives us entree to understanding all of the facets from an economic lens with oppression. And from a housing lens, it gives us an opportunity to start to think about housing not as people being worthy or not worthy, right? But as a human right. And so where can we maybe get into that space about changing our own mindset around the housing work that we're doing? And I say that as someone who has worked in domestic violence for, I think, like 16 years now. And I recently started to think about housing, in the last few years as a human right and someone being in the movement again, right? And so that's that growing. How are we all kind of growing to think about our economic work and our social justice work broadly in a way that grows and challenges ourselves to recognize that we're operating under systemic oppression and systemic racism. And it's not going to happen overnight, but we're growing and learning to do differently all the time.
Right. I will share just an experience that I remember having. I am newer to the domestic violence community. I didn't grow up through the DV movement, but I have partnered with DV providers, with legal services advocates, with public defenders. And get DV providers and public defenders in a room together. Don't want to do that. How do we have the conversation so that we're thinking about what the family needs, what each individual needs, and see ourselves as players who don't have to play the game we've been dealt, right? But we can actually make up a new game. We can actually say, criminalizing domestic violence hasn't served most families. Protection is important. How can we talk about that in a way that is not about demonizing the other and also not about forsaking our deeply felt responsibilities to people who have been harmed by violence from intimate partners and others? Again, sort of stretching the box, right? And so I'm curious, where in your communities or in your work, or maybe in your own experience, you've stretched a box, right? You've thought outside of the box, or you've pressed someone to stretch outside the box in a way that you were happy about, that you were proud about. Olivia, I'm asking you to unmute. Please go ahead.
Sure. So, hi all. I'm Olivia. I am an attorney, fairly new to practicing, and I do a lot of immigration work right now. And so one way that I've really had to shift my mindset outside of kind of the traditional attorney-client relationship is that, and this is something I talked about in my group too, is that most of my clients are leading extremely complicated lives. They've got a lot of balls in the air and they're dealing with, being at lots of different intersections of, race and nationality and like citizenship status essentially. And we primarily help LGBTQ and HIV affected folks. So pretty much all my clients also have an identity in there that they're dealing with. And so, usually if you're an attorney, if you make an appointment with a client, you expect them to show up on time and prepared with whatever documents you ask them to prepare and ready to just like boom, 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 like get on with your day. But I've really had to take a step back and realize that like if my client is coming late to a meeting or has to miss a meeting at the last minute or things like that, or isn't communicating with me about that sort of thing the way that I might want, it's because of like their positionality. It's because they are living a life that is like radically different from mine. And I need to be centering that much more so than it might be the traditional thought process. And so I've also been really pushing that with I've got a couple of other attorneys I work with so that we're trying to now build systems where like you have a half-hour wiggle room built into any of your appointment time slots so that you're not then feeling pressed and rushed and feeling like you've got to like yell at your client because you budgeted your time properly, or really making sure that across the board we're offering options to meet virtually when we can, or figuring out new ways of using technology to like get documents signed and translated more efficiently. And so just really trying to take into account how can we be flexible, because we're the only part of the system that can be flexible. The government's not going to be flexible. The courts are not going to be flexible. These people's lives are the way that they are. So like how can we bend to better serve our clients and their actual needs?
Thank you for sharing, Olivia. Anyone else with a story? And while people are thinking or while I'm waiting for hands, I really want to highlight that there's like the individual shift in your mindset. It's like, this isn't about like not being respectful. This is about like life circumstances. And then the institutional shift where the institution then makes the change to allow for that flexibility, and that becomes a practice in the culture of the organization. And I would go the step further if we're thinking about like how can we be proactive, intersectionally, anti-oppression oriented, and this is the long story, right? How do we get the courts to institute that kind of flexibility? It might seem crazy to even suggest that to a judge, but it seemed crazy back in the day that women would be judges, right? So we have to think down the road about how our system could look differently and how we can engage it differently. Other questions, other thoughts, something that you might be proud of, a shift that you've made or a shift that you've wanted to make and weren't quite sure how to make it?
Yes, so actually on my group, we also share how for my organization, for example, everything that is related legal services or emotional support, we don't offer in-house. But I think one of the things in my organization is our staff, and we are carrying that caring for each other. And what we do is offer that space to our clients, to our survivors. We are not counselors, we are not mental health providers, but we still give that possibility to the clients to be comfortable in our space, to tell them, yes, we don't offer mental health services here, we are not counselors, but they still need that space to express their concerns, legal, they are fear for the abuser, they need shelter, they need legal services, they need food, they need so many things. That these spaces that we offer at the organization is like a small space, is just a couple of minutes, but they still help the clients to at least release, to feel safe, to tell them, we will do our best to help you, to connect you with the right organization. We do a lot of referrals to our partnerships and other lawyers. So I think this is that what we do. We don't offer those services, but it's still for our clients and the staff is something that is part of our services as well. Mm-hmm.
And so I've sort of transitioned to our next section. And so I'll give it a little bit of framing. One of the things that we that Mona and I were talking about. We're like, what are the things that excite us in this conversation about intersectional identity and anti-racism, anti-oppression work? Because it's such a huge topic. And one of the things is, how do we, shift systems? How do we get ourselves thinking beyond the day-to-day to what's the bigger change we could be working for, 5-10 years down the road, or 2-3 months down the road, whatever it might be. And so one of the things that comes up for me is always like leadership and how we work through the resistance and get the resources that we need to do the work that we want to do. I have some definitions of power and leadership, and I can put them in the chat, but we're also short on time. So I just want to say, of the resources that are, that we can have, we can get external resistance and resources, organizational resistance and resources, and then we have our internal resistance and our internal resources. And that's what we want to talk about today. Like, what is it that allows me to say the hard thing in the conversation, like the conversation that needs to be had? What is the thing that I bring to the table because of my experience that gives me insights that I can rely on, and that gives me the willingness to challenge when my experience is challenged? Like, how do I know, like, when it makes sense to take that risk? Because, it could be a risk of uncomfortable conflict, or a risk of my job. And what are the things that anchor me so that I can actually stand in a place of both confidence, strength, and commitment to do what I can do, and what makes sense for me. So part of that is values and getting very clear about what it is that I, will draw my line in the sand on. Part of it is recognizing when I need to educate myself about something, where my resistance is, I'm really uncomfortable with, actually, this was a while back. I was like, I recognize I'm like not fully comfortable in trans spaces. So I started to go to expose myself to trans spaces and like conversations so that I could work on myself and get myself out of the way to show up in service fully. What are some of your areas of resistance? And what are some of the assets that you bring to these conversations that can help you to do the hard thing, and to do perhaps the long range thing that could have implications down the road? And I'll share one more example. I'm a consultant. I work with organizations, talk about race and culture and respect, and how to hold each other accountable. And I have had to fire clients who were unwilling to have the race conversation. That's money that I don't get, that I need to eat. But I refuse to do the work if I can't actually do the work. And I'm to be able to do that. In other settings, I've made the choice to like state something, and this is when I was employed in a particular place. It's like, okay, I'm going to say what needs to be said. I know that there may be repercussions, and I'm going to take the repercussions because I can't not say it. And that was something that I was comfortable doing. So that's just a couple of examples that like different levels of engagement. And lastly, because I know we talked about this, is being in my body and noticing when I'm getting uncomfortable, noticing when my insight, when my spidey sense goes off, and actually paying attention to it, and doing, self-care is a thing, but actually taking well enough care of myself so that I can give to others, not depleting myself. I've been through that cycle where you just go, and then you pass out. And that doesn't serve me, and it doesn't serve the movement or the people that you're working with, because it's modeling the wrong behavior, or modeling perhaps behavior that could evolve to a place that would be more sustainable.
I shared the definitions in the chat box, and one of the things that you mentioned that really resonated with me too, Camille, was how you've shown leadership in those different spaces, personally, professionally, organizationally, like, and all those things together as they intersect, because your person is all of those things. One of the things that has been resonating for me more with my leadership is thinking about spaces and work that is important to me and that I prioritize, but taking leadership in a different way. And the way that that's taken me has been more in connecting people, because that is something that I have to give. In the past and in different spaces and times, my leadership has been taking the lead or spearheading something and reimagining that this time and stage of my world and my life and my priorities, that leadership is looking like me connecting and bringing people together so that they can lead and take charge and move things forward, which is a different way of thinking about leadership. And when you talked about what can we bring, what I had brought traditionally or historically is now different than what I'm bringing. And when you're talking about your body and your mind, doing this work for, I think it's 16, 17 years. It's between 15 and 17. COVID threw me off. I haven't done math lately, but my energy at the beginning of my kind of movement work was very different than what it is now. And sometimes, we have to take reflection on where energy is and our spirit is. And, more so lately, it's been my energy and my spirit is to connect people. And that really has been an ethos of my work. And how are we building relationships with each other and bridging relationships and supporting people? And so that feels like a better place for me to have leadership in a different way like that. And I don't have to be the face, the person that's driving the train. I can be a support and a connector and in a different way and still be a leader in a different way. We often think about it in hierarchical standpoints as also in positions of power, that if you're not in a position of power, you don't influence it, you're not a leader. And that is, we know that absolutely to not be true, because leadership shows up in a lot of ways. And I think this is a really wonderful opportunity for us to, even kind of reshape that word so that itself isn't oppressive, right? That
Right.
leadership isn't a hierarchical oppressive word, but that it is a communal and relational word. And so that's just something that's been kind of resonating with me in that word and how leadership has changed for me over my time.
Thank you so much for that, Mona. I think that's absolutely true. One of the takeaways that we want for you all is that you are all leaders, and leading is an activity. You may not be the executive director of your organization, or you may be, but you have agency and access to power and influence that you can cultivate and use for the benefit of others. And you can cultivate and use in a way that is anti-oppressive and that recognizes our multiple identities and the beauty and strength that comes from all of our different experiences being held well together. So I think actually it might be good for us to transition to putting things into sort of asking for our reflections in the chat and then sending it back to Kiru. I'm a little transparent facilitation here. And so I'll throw it back to Mona for this last piece, and then we can sign out.
We just wanted to wrap up, and I think we kind of we segued into it already, share as you're comfortable in the chat or just kind of sharing out loud, one word, a takeaway or a feeling, 1 or 2 words or, thoughts or feelings, a takeaway that you might have after your conversations, just kind of a general, or just something that really resonated after hearing some of our conversations today. So, that can be in the chat or on mute, whatever that looks like for you. Takeaway means different things to everybody all the time. Some people think it means an action. Some people, it could be just a reflection point. As one of these things that we're talking about, we want to also center that it doesn't have to be action oriented. Showing up today, listening, being present is something that you're doing to be a part of this movement work. And white supremacy and white supremacy culture often kind of wants to take us over and say, we need an action, we need to check something off a box in order to say we did something. And that is not the case for us. Our presence is valuable in and of itself. So maybe it's a thought, a feeling, put it in the chat, you want to go off mute, we'll let people raise their hands or just off mute.
Great.
And
I'll just say, I'm just going to put my 30-second timer on just to give people space to, if you have something that you want to put in the chat, that's a takeaway or feeling, do that. If you want to just sit for a second and say, what is it I want to say? But just a few seconds to pull it together. We'd love to hear a reflection of where you're at and what you're taking away. That's great. And that's about 30 seconds. And I love this because sometimes the work is coming together. This group was a helpful reminder that there are so many of us out here doing this work, and that made me feel a lot less alone. We are in this together, and that's a source of strength and power that we absolutely should leverage. So I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to be with you today. And I see a hand from Alondra.
Hi, kind of my takeaway, I'm gonna do like 2 words, like section together. Like the first one that comes to mind is inform and empower. I'm really grateful for this training because I was able to sort of like scope back out and remember that we are in a place with all of these oppressions. So sort of informing you and like keeping on with that information of like how our system works is really important to sort of empower us and empower the people that we work with, and also to sort of informing ourselves about where these like people are coming from, like their cultures, like just who people are in general, and having that like humanity with somebody of understanding who they are, where they're coming from. And that way you can have that empowerment of feeling validated and knowing who you are so that you can sort of navigate these systems. And then the other half is bridge and share, so that way these sort of 2 worlds of like the system that we're living in and us as people, how we can sort of share ourselves to be in this space, and how we can bridge maybe sort of a culture to sort of the oppression that is going on, so that we can sort of navigate away from oppression and sort of value and validate where people are coming from and be able to share these spaces and get out of oppression.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Alondra. Any other hands raised or thoughts that folks would like to go before we share? I see we are just a couple minutes over time, but we're here if there's another voice that wants to be heard or another chat that someone wants to place in the meeting chat. Great. And so I'll ask Mona to say her farewells and then to turn it over to Nikira.
Thank you so much, y'all, for sharing space with us today. My quick feeling is just of abundance. And so that's what I'm left with after our conversation today. And I'll hand that over to Nkira. Thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Camille, Mona, for a wonderful presentation and discussion. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us and your time, especially. Please feel free to reach out to any of the presenters with any of the questions you may have about this discussion today. Their emails are up on the screen right now. Also, please, if you would be so kind to fill out our evaluation link, which Jazz will put in the chat, we appreciate you for that. Also, reach out to CSAJ for any individual or organizational technical assistance needs you may have on the different ranges of issues that CSAJ covers related to economic justice. We would share with you more resources. And if you want to connect with us on one-on-one, please feel free to get in touch with us. The email is info@csaj.org. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your week.